Hey everyone, and welcome to the Level Design Lobby, which is a great one as we've got a very special guest, which is the magnificent Chris Totten, and we're talking about sort of how he got into the love of games, his passion, obviously the amazing book that he has written, and much more. So without further ado, so Chris, how are you doing, mate? You alright?
Yeah. Like we said in the pre-show discussion, I just started at Kent State University in Northeast Ohio, so I'm happy to be back in my home region and home state. A first semester is always kind of tough because you're doing a lot of new class preps, but I'm really enjoying it. I'm really loving the students. I'm really, loving the what I've seen so far.
That's awesome, man. That's awesome. So for those who don't, say, know much about you, can you give us a brief backstory on how you came to get involved in video games and also other types of games, which we'll talk about a little bit later on?
Sure. Hi, I'm Chris. I teach game development, like I said, at Kent State University in Northeast Ohio. I teach at 3 of their regional campuses, including the main Kent campus, the Stark County campus, and the Tuscarawas County campus. So my backstory is that I have 2 degrees in architecture, a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Architecture. And while I was in college, a friend of mine in the computer science program at my alma mater, the Catholic University of America, said, "Hey, let's make games together." Famous last words. And we did that a little bit. It kind of worked, but it helped me learn more about the programs I was using, like 3D Max and Photoshop. But also, I got really into studying game design. So I started reading books on game design. This is not long after things like Rules of Play came out by Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman.
Fantastic.
And yeah, so I got the bug. I started studying game design, making little prototypes on my own. And then in grad school, I did my thesis on blending game design principles and architectural principles. So when I got out of grad school, nobody was building anything. This was during the recession. And I looked at my skill set and I was like, okay, well, I can do this 3D thing. I might as well try to find a job doing something with games. I got a job teaching that 3D software. And while I was teaching, I also decided, well, why don't I keep making prototypes and keep honing my skills with game art? I eventually got a job at other schools, got contracts to work on mobile games and what are called serious games, which are games for non-entertainment purposes like education or simulation. Because I was in the DC area and that's what there was a lot of over there. And here I am now. I also in 2014 published a book called An Architectural Approach to Level Design, using a lot of my architectural background. And then in 2016, I published a follow-up to that called Level Design Processes and Experiences, which includes a series of essays by level designers in different sections of the field, talking about their experiences with playing game worlds, building game worlds, designing game worlds, and testing game worlds.
It's an amazing journey you've had, mate, and quite a different one to some of the guests I've previously had on. So it's a really interesting one to hear how you got involved, and I'm sure most of the people who listen to the podcast are aware of, if not both your books, very much the first, as that's been a great reference, as we spoke earlier, for myself, and it's one that I do recommend people to go check out. And I guess one of the questions would be, after you started in architecture, as you said, what do you find is some of the biggest common sort of features or experiences when you're designing a building in real life to that of designing a level then, mate?
So one of the things that I find really common between the two is very human-centric design. Right. I think level design is very focused on the person who is using it. It's almost like user experience design, but in 3D space. And I've started even to see some essays and some different things about, like, I got this book recently that was like the basics of 4D media and art, and it talks a lot about architecture, and then it talks about video games right afterward, and I was like, holy cow. You're like, yes, wow. Yes, this, yeah. Absolutely. And it is this space that you experience in real time walking through it. So I think if you think about that, they're very similar, except with games you get to have like challenges and dangerous stuff. But there's a lot of things that are universal truths of how people understand the world around them that I think totally applies not only to 3D games, but to 2D games. Like height can be scary, Yeah. So like that's always true, unless you put a railing or something and you give them a vantage point, then maybe height is strategically important. So, it's the same thing as like you design a tall tower for a view. Well, you see that in a lot of video games. So there's a lot of commonalities. So I think, I know of several people who are former architects who work in the game industry. And so I know that that's a pretty common path to getting into this.
Yeah, no, I must admit, I know a few people who started off either as an architect, who then became either a level designer or an urban planner, or other people who again studied architecture and have come over to be level designers as well. I think there's some like really good points there, and I think it's important. I'm sure you preach this to your students as well, but I think it's very important that students do, and every level designer, but I'm just saying primarily for people just starting to come into it, to study architecture, like just even look around the room that you are in, because most people are guilty for just making a box for the first level, which is understandable, but once you start to look around you and see all how the walls change and concave and extrude in certain ways, I think it's fantastic to just see that around you. So I think that's some great points there. And I guess my next question for you then, mate, is like, so after seeing all these commonalities and that similarities, what was it that made you decide to actually start writing these books then? What made you inspired to go, right, I want to talk about these two together?
So for my thesis, I actually developed a lot of these concepts. I just started, doing a lot of research and seeing the similarities. And I guess I always wanted to turn it into something like that. Yeah. The original intention was just to write that out as the thesis, and then my thesis advisors wisely were like, no, pump the brakes here. You only have a few months, right? So it's something I always really wanted to do. And, I had the opportunity to write like a software manual book, earlier in my career. Oh, wow. On just how to do like, characters in the Blender 3D tool. And, I took it so that I would at least have something on my resume to show that I could do a book. And but I mean, that was always the goal, was to like get to that book. So yeah, it's kind of weird, because that was like, once I published that, it was a weird experience. It's like, wow, that was like a major goal of mine. Holy crap. I think the weird thing about writing a book like that, though, was I've never worked AAA, and okay. I said in my bio, like I worked in DC a lot. I worked on, serious games. I worked on a lot of indie projects. I worked on a lot of, mobile projects, things like that. So I've definitely been making games the whole time. Like I've got, at this point, like over 20 games in my resume. Yeah. But, a few of them people recognize, which is nice. But, that was kind of a weird experience. Like right before I was making the book, I had a really big bout of imposter syndrome. Like, man, there's all these famous level designers who work at big studios. Who am I to write this? And then, you know, just from like going to GDC, being part of the IGDA, things like that, I met people and I would tell them about the project, and people, like famous people, and they'd be like, oh, finally somebody's writing a book on level design. Holy cow, I'm so happy about this. So once, you know, people that I really looked up to were supportive of the project, once I realized that they were like almost waiting for somebody to go and take this on, was when I kind of got over that a little bit and was like, okay, it's okay for someone like me to do this. Maybe all it takes is just to be the person who sits down and starts typing in Microsoft Word. You know, you don't necessarily have to be the person that does all, like, you know, has a long career, but you should definitely learn from those people and cite them a lot. You know, so that was like a weird confidence boost that I learned a lot from, or a weird experience that I learned a lot from, was just like doing this thing, questioning it a lot, and then telling people about it and have them actually be pretty excited.
Yeah, man, I bet that was a huge confidence boost. I think that's always great. And I mean, imposter syndrome is one of the biggest things in this, related to video games. Everyone I speak to, and myself included, you know, all suffer from that at some point. So it's really interesting to hear you mention that as well, because I think it's a lot more prevalent than people realize. And, what I tell
students, what I tell students too is like, I tell them these stories too, because I'm like, look, here's my personal experiences with it, because they all go through it. And especially when you're working in a place that's not a hub. Like, I don't work in a hub, and I've never worked in a hub. There was one AAA studio in, like, when I was in DC, and that would be Bethesda.
Right.
Well, there was also some EA studios like Mythic, but they were shut down while I was out there. So there was one like sustaining one, and that, you know, it was just as hard to get into them as it was for any other place, and there were game programs around, so everybody was trying to get into it. So they have the same like glut of talent, but not of job positions. So I always tell my students that when you are not in a hub, and so I wouldn't really call DC a hub, and I wouldn't call Northeast Ohio a hub, even though there is a pretty awesome games, like indie game scene in like Cleveland and Columbus and Cincinnati. But you know, I tell people, just like, don't be afraid to put yourself out there. And I know that sounds really terrifying, but you know, even just like go to meetings, go to the game developers meetup, or go to conferences, you know, especially like those little regional ones. We have one called GDEX in Columbus that's super great. And once you go to a place like that and you're talking with these professionals, suddenly it's real. It's not this fairy tale where you're just like, man, I wonder how Horizon was made. Yeah. It's like you get to see people, and this is why I showed GDC talks in my classroom, is because then they hear from somebody who actually went through it. And they talk about very relatable things, like, I made this level and it sucked. Yes. So I had to remake it. And here's what I learned. And it's like, wow, that makes a lot of sense. But yeah, I don't know. If you put yourself out there, I always say the game industry is one where the front door is really well locked, but all the windows are open.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah. So it's like, you either get yourself up to the point where you get through the front door, or you find the window. And sometimes, you know, going through that window and finding alternate, you know, I know tons of people who worked in serious games or educational games and then got a AAA job because they were like, oh, okay, so you've made a game before. Cool. Like, here, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, man, I couldn't agree more with that, and especially because recently I've just seen a few tweets come up over the past few days, and speaking to a few people that I know that have just started, they also feel that, you know, oh, I've made a mistake and I had to redo my level, everything's wrong. And it's just like, no, that's just part of the process. No matter how many years of experience you have, you're not going to get everything right on the first try. Your favorite designers will not get everything right on the first try, and it'll be restarted again. So I think that's right. And as you said, just get out there and just chat to people. I think there's great people, and I'm sure you know yourself. There's just so many friendly people in this industry as well. So many people who just want to listen and just want to just talk about games. So I always think that's great for it.
Yeah, I've met a lot of like of my heroes who just by being present at like I don't want to use GDC as an example because like GDC is really expensive and like prohibitively so for a lot of people, but you know, like a game dev meetup, a conference, whether that be GDC or it be, you know, like Meaningful Play, which is a smaller academic one that I was at last week, still international in scale, or even just like a regional one or a local meetup. You know, if you talk to people, most people in the game industry are just like, oh yeah, this person's here, they're great, awesome, you know, you've made a game, great. They're not like, well, I made you know, that game that you played when you were 6, so don't talk to me. You know, I've maybe only met 1 or 2 people like that.
They are out there, but very few of them. Very few of them. You know. Okay, well, I was going to say my next question is then for you, man, is out of all the things that you've written so far, that you've wrote, sorry, is there something that sticks out to you that to you is one of the key things that you want to share and that you've also learned from this experience? I've put you on the spot with this one.
Yeah, no, well, you mean in terms of level design or in terms of just like the experience of writing?
I'd say for both, please, mate, if that's all right.
Okay, well, level design, what do I always use? Well, we talked about this a little bit in the pre-show discussion, but like, you know, right after my book came out, I read this book by Anna Anthropy and Naomi Clark called Game Design Vocabulary, and Anna Anthropy talks about this idea of scenes, and it's like design, like she describes it as whatever the player is dealing with at the time, and you know, it's sort of implied that kind of means like whatever's on the screen at the time. So it's like I always just in my head make my rule of thumb like 1 screen space worth. And, you know, like that was one of those things where I was like, oh my gosh, where was this when I was writing? You know, because it's like, I was like, that's it. That's level design. That is so good. It's like make these chunks. Because like, I intuited something. I don't even know if that's a word, but my intuition. Yeah, right. My intuition was that was the case, because I remember, you know, we were working on a mobile game called Swarm, and it was this like platformer, but you were on a tablet, and you like had to tilt the tablet, and that made the little character roll around, and then you like tapped or flipped the screen up to jump. And we had to teach this mechanic. So we realized like, through playtesting that it worked best if you had all the sort of like, let's just call them pieces on the board of the mechanic in a screen space. And that was like, oh, okay, so people can see the chain of causality of like, I do this and then this happens and then the door opens. And that was able to, you know, connect for players. And I wrote about that. And then, you know, so I was like kind of aware of that, but I was like, oh my gosh, this is so much better. Like this fully written out and codified version of this. So I think that's not technically that's not something I wrote, but I think that was one of the things that I learned most. You know, actually, I learned a lot from that book in particular that I've tried to put into my writing. I learned to not be afraid to talk about my own games. And I always worried that people would think that was really, you know, like, I don't know, really, you know, self-centered of me or something like that.
Right, I see.
Yeah, but, you know, she wrote about them so well, about her own games, and used them as examples so well. And it kind of hit me. It's like, well, why wouldn't you write about the things that you were intimately involved in creating? Like, that makes more sense than trying to, you know, cite stuff that you're kind of guessing at, you know, if that was the intention. And then the other thing too was like, she talks about, she uses this one game. It was like a mining puzzle game. And it was not Spelunky, but like one of her own games. And she just cites it again and again and again and again and again. And then it gets, so you're like, wow, what is this like 8-hour epic that I got to find this thing? It must be like, it sounds so rich. And then in the section where Naomi Clark takes over, she says, in Anna's 3-minute game. And it was that game. And I was like, holy cow, it's a 3-minute game. So I think that taught me, like, you know, everything you make is educational, even if it's not like a game that makes $1 million or sells 1 million copies. It's always meaningful, but sometimes you just get lucky.
Yeah, man. No, that's it. I think everything's a learning experience. So that's a valid point there, man. So thank you for sharing those ones with us. So I want to ask you now, like, what are you currently working on? Because I know you're with your own studio, Piper Breakfast Studios. So how's that going for you, sir?
Pretty well. I mean, I started that studio to have something to release games. I really love teaching and working in academia. So the studio is mainly my way to release projects when I do research and things like that. So one of the games that I made a few years ago was called Laziski's Revenge. And that one was a lot of fun. It was a modern art game. So I have this, like, you know, project that I keep coming back to every once in a while that I call Atelier Games. And it's this thing where I take the work of a famous artist and try to learn about design from them by making a game from it. And I've only really finished one of these. I have a few other prototypes, but I've only really finished one of these, and it's Laziski's Revenge. But I wanted to see if I could make an action game out of this, like, piece of bullshit, like this Bolshevik propaganda poster called it's called Beat the Whites with the Red Wedge. And it's basically this red triangle superimposed on a white circle, and it looks like it's bursting through like a black barrier to get to this white circle. And it's supposed to be like the Bolshevik Revolution killing the czars or whatever. Right. But I looked at it, I was like, wow, that's, you know, really the core of this project is I want to experiment with game art making methods that are not like Photoshop or pixel art or 3D, because I want to be able to, like, teach, you know, ultimately kids how to make game art by, you know, doing stuff that they already know how to do, like markers or, you know, craft paper or you know, painting or whatever. So that's like the real goal here. So I was like, well, I need some I don't know, some proof to this method. So that's why I decided on, like, famous art. So really, you know, Laziski's Revenge is a game made out of paper cutouts of shapes. So like something anybody could make. And, you know, I looked at the art and I was like, well, okay, so trying to get to this enemy that's hiding behind a barrier, and you're this, like, sort of, we'll call it vaguely spaceship-like thing. I was like, why does that sound familiar? And I'm like, Yar's Revenge on Atari. So that's why it's Laziski's Revenge. So it's this arcade.
Right,
yeah,
okay,
exactly. but it became this great level design project because it turned into like, I'm going to experiment with scenes because every screen should be a self-contained work of art. Like a self-contained like poster of graphic design. And then I don't know, it was like a super fun game to work on. And I bring it up now, even though it's like 3 years old, just because it was a small game. It took me 3 months to complete, so relatively small, but I still I will still get people saying, hey, can we put this in a museum exhibit or something like that? Again, it goes into that like small games can be successful and you can learn a lot from them, because I learned a lot from it. A game that I've been working on like forever and it's almost done, but we're in the polishing phase. So, it's like sort of a hobby game project that some friends and I in the industry come back to every once in a while, called Dead Man's Trail. It doesn't have any highfalutin academic ideas behind it. It's just a fun zombie game.
Always got to go back to zombie at some point, man. It's always the fun ones.
I really love zombies, even though they're not trendy anymore. But and I realized this had been done before, but it's Oregon Trail with zombies. That was totally done by Oregon Trail. But our goal is to make something more modern. It's really good. Like, we're really proud of it. Again, it's just one of those, we need to polish it up and like, so we can get it out. There's a few like bugs and things like that. So, but yeah, I mean, we're almost done with that. I keep coming. I think it's a game project that we way overscoped at the beginning of our careers. That's why it's like a few of us coming back and forth to it. Right. And we've made a bunch of stuff in the middle, but everything I've ever learned, I kind of like, I've been able to bring back to that project and be like, oh no, we should actually do. So this was stupid of me to do it this way because I didn't know any better at the time. So now I'm going to tweak it this way. Yeah. And so it was a long journey, but we're almost done. I've almost been like taking some time off of that though to work on this other game, which is not digital at all. It's called La Mancha, and it is a card game based on a storytelling card game based on the novel Don Quixote, and the gist is you have these 3 decks in front of you, and there's a journey deck, a chivalry deck, and a treasure deck, and you have a hand of chivalry cards, and you turn over a journey card and it will have a story prompt on it, either in a situation from the book, or a character, or a challenge to overcome. If it's a situation, which is called an encounter, you put down 1 chivalry card and have to tell a story about how your knight would overcome that situation. If you have a character, which is a love card, you have to take 3 of your cards and compose a poem to that character to try to have them give you their favor. And all of these, by the way, the person who drew that card is the judge. So you have to like say this to your friend. You have to like, compose a love poem to your friend, which actually like turned the game into a like, a lot of people of diverse backgrounds, especially, queer playtesters that I've had have really enjoyed this aspect of it because it turns into like non-gender normative gameplay.
Wow.
Yeah. Like, and I'll say it right now, being the like cisgender white guy, I know that, I'm very sensitive to the idea of stopping and listening and letting, not putting in my 2 cents on these issues, but I've been told by people who represent that group that it's actually has some of these wonderful effects that they really love in representation. So I'm particularly very proud of it because it makes people very happy. In a less gendered way, also people have said, well, did you intend it to be socially positive because people are basically competing to compliment somebody? And I'm like, whoa, that's really cool. I just thought it was a neat thing from the book. But it worked out really well. And I mean, and I tried to make the characters 50-50 of the genders represented in Don Quixote. Just because, I think it's better when you have that representation in a game. So I always try to make my characters like, different genders, not just all like male dudes. And then so that's what the love mechanic is. And then the third one is more of like a RPG battle die roll thing, but it turns into this like really powerful storytelling engine. But it's actually going up on Kickstarter November 1st. So based on the schedule you gave me, it'll probably actually be up on Kickstarter by the time people hear this.
Yeah, which will be awesome, because there will be a link down in the description below for you to check this out. I've watched some of the gameplay that you've already got out there, and it looked fantastic from my point of view, where I saw someone sing to someone else, and I thought that was brilliant. I thought that was fantastic.
Yeah, I would be a bad game designer and pop culture knower. I don't know. If I made a Don Quixote game and I didn't put in a reference to the musical Man of La Mancha, there's the Impossible Dream card if you play it. So the chivalry cards have like effects that you can screw with each other when like at climactic parts of the game. Yeah. Kind of like if you've ever played Munchkin.
Yes.
Yeah. So you know how you can like be like, "Hi, I've totally defeated this monster," and you can be like, "No, you didn't."
Yeah. Psych.
Yeah. Like it has those kind of effects. So one of them is that like, okay, yeah, we're totally going to play this round, but everybody needs to sing. Which is always really funny.
That's brilliant, that one, especially if you've got a bad voice. That'd be the worst one.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, this is one of the funny things about the gameplay is like I learned a lot about how to affect player behavior. How much info to give somebody who's never read it. Because it's got to be for a wide audience, and not everybody has read this 988 in the edition I have page book. So I want it to be accessible by people who never read it, which in turn turned it into an educational game. Which was really funny. But, then it's also this funny party game. So I wanted it to like induce silly behavior, which has you act out what Don Quixote does in the book. And then, but it's also like informing you of what is going on in the story, which is really interesting.
That sounds fascinating. So what was it that drew you to this particular book, these particular stories? What was it that made you think that you could take something from this and apply this gameplay elements to it?
So actually it was Liziski's Revenge a little bit. Part of the, and I've actually thought, I was like, oh, should I call this an Atelier game, like not on the box but kind of privately, because in a way I'm doing the same thing, right? I'm learning from a great piece of literature or art, and I guess the process that I learned, and you asked me like what was one of the things that I really thought about, and I talked about like other people's works. Yeah. One of the things that I really always lean on in my level design writing is, make the level about a mechanic, make the level about a mechanic, make the level about a mechanic, make it about a concise set of actions, and, don't put everything and the kitchen sink into it.
Yes.
Think about like Mario Maker, when that was really big and you'd go and you'd play levels online. There would just be like a tower of Bowsers that also had Buzzy Beetle helmets on, that were also flying, that were also giant, right? Make the level about a thing and then just juice that mechanic, use it and make it like stretch it to its limits. So that was the thing that I really love writing about, and is taking a mechanic and evolving it, and then also teaching it, like the art of teaching a mechanic.
Yes.
There's that principal Kisho Tenketsu. I probably pronounced it wrong.
I know which one you're referring to, yes. I don't know if I could say it correctly either, so I'm not even going to attempt to.
But like Mark Brown talks about it in the Game Maker's Toolkit video series, and it was, used, it was like cited by the director of Super Mario Land and 3D World. Basically, you start in like the basic version of the mechanic, and you teach it to the player in a safe space, and then you add a few more stakes, and you build it a little bit. Maybe there's more enemies or spikes or lava or something. Or they have to do it in a timed fashion, and then you twist it. Then you like take it and reverse it somehow. But then you have like the final exam. So the final exam is supposed to be at the end of the level or at the end of the part of the level. They have to show their mastery of the mechanic in all of its forms. And I think that's really, really cool. I used it in Laziski by, looking at the verbs of what I saw happening in the poster, and saying, well, okay, this is what the game is going to be about. And then I would take other posters by Laziski and artists that were influenced by him and see, okay, what verbs could be in this poster. And then that became World 2, World 3, World 4, World 5 of the game. With La Mancha, that was so I read Don Quixote. I keep going back and forth between like the correct Spanish pronunciation and the English pronunciation where we really work, or the American pronunciation where we really work the O. And I'm trying not to. But I had read the book. I actually found it in a used bookstore, this like gorgeous hardcover copy for like $20. So I'm like, all right, I'm finally going to do it. I'm finally going to read the Quixote. And so I did, and I was like, I love this. It is one of the greatest books I've ever read.
Yeah.
And because I'm a game designer, I'm like, I want to play this game. I want to be Don Quixote. But I'm like, I don't know how, because like no video game that I could produce on my own would ever I could like make by myself or with like a small team, like maybe a game where you joust windmills or something, which is, it's not the book.
No.
There's like so much packed into it. So then a friend of mine, Ian Pepik, who's, an architecture school friend, he issued this challenge to our board game group, just our social group. Hey, everybody, let's, instead of bringing a game that we bought, bring a game that we designed to our next session. And I'm like, that's it. Don Quixote. Blah. Now I'm going to keep tripping over myself.
It's going to be fine.
Yeah. Don Quixote, the card game. So, like Laziski, I looked at the verbs. I tried to figure out what the actions of the game were. And then what I usually do, and you talked earlier about how every game is different, right?
Yes.
Well, the way I design is that I start from, and what I do with these works is I will look at a piece of work like this. And it's almost the same thing as if you were, designing for a franchise. If you're working on like a licensed game, you look at, well, an ideal world, you look at the property, or in this case, the artwork, and you say, what is going on in this? What actions are happening in this? What game actions can I make? And then what I do is I will look at I will look for existing games that mimic that. So with Laziski, it was Yar's Revenge. And with this, it was Cards Against Humanity, a little bit of the Moby Dick card game, if you any readers are aware of it. And like, if you look at the game, somebody even remarked at Meaningful Play, hey, that visually resembles Moby Dick. And I'm like, yeah, that was intentional, because that game has the best form factor ever.
Yeah.
It's just so nicely concise and fits on a bookshelf next to your actual copy of Moby Dick. So I took a little bit of that. I took a little bit of Munchkin. I put it in a blender and saw what came out. And, when you start fixing your prototype, that is this like taped together cobble of influences, that's when you find the things that make your game unique. So, where our game is no longer just Cards Against Humanity because you're telling whole stories. And because, like as a reward for telling the best story, you get treasure, and that's like equipping your character. So that's a little bit of Munchkin, but it's, it has enough to differentiate it in the way that the treasures work and things like that. The only thing that really resembles Moby Dick anymore is, a little bit of the like the way that you roll dice, that's about it. And it has that journey deck the same way that game has like an ocean deck that's just like the cards on your quest. But even that, after the most recent play test, I'm totally changing the way that's going to work. But once it's almost like through play testing and fixing problems is where your game becomes your game and not your influences.
No, that's it. I think it's great that you've also taken the time to re-look at the work as well, because sometimes when you're so close to a project, you don't always see the similarities in a sense. So I think it's nice that you've taken the time to look through and go, okay, well, this is our unique factor in a sense, the thing that helps make us, and I think that's really nice. I have a question from the card design standpoint, because I listened to a podcast called Drive to Work, Magic the Gathering, and it's a really interesting one, because again, it may not be to do with level design, but I think a lot of the design theories are very similar to that of what I do with it. But he was saying about one of the things he spoke about was how to design the cards, and you mentioned earlier about how to give the player the right information and not overload them with what you have as well. How was that? How did you guys find the right balance of the right information and pretty picture in a sense on the cards?
Well, what I love about, and this is almost like getting into comic book design theory, is that like in the 70s, there were a lot of experimentations with comic books where they realized you had visuals and you had words, and both of those are mediums that can present information. So there were some like weird comic experiments with what is in the bubbles is different from what's on the what's in the picture. And some of the cards are just straight up illustrations of scenes from the book, which like I really wanted to do those because that's just really fun. But say, for example, with the treasure cards, one of the things that we did was they're jokes. Like in Don Quixote, one of the most famous scenes is that he attacks a barber on the road who, because it's raining, puts his shaving basin on his head to shield himself from the rain. So, but it's this brass shaving basin. It's very shiny, and Don Quixote sees it and thinks that's a golden helmet from this ancient Moorish king, and I want it. So he attacks the barber and takes the helmet and wears it around for the rest of the book. And everybody's like, all right, weird guy with this barber's basin on his head. Okay. And that's the iconic hat that he's wearing, is this joke. So in terms of illustrations, they were part of the comedy. So I could have something called, like, some of the treasures are like straight up, you get Lancelot's sword. It's a cool looking sword, right? But then some of them are things like the knight's helmet and it's a bucket. Yeah, but it's supposed to, and like the text says like, behold the mightiest helmet in the land, but it's
brilliant. Yeah,
it's a bucket. Or his lady love, Dulcinea del Toboso. The text, it says, it's Don Quixote's lady love, yada yada yada, but it's, the picture is she may or may not be real. So the picture is that, like, I painted the optical illusion of the young woman and the old woman, where if you like look at it one way or another, it's either a young woman or an old woman. Yeah,
that's clever, man. That's really smart.
So yeah, that's illustrations helped in that way. And then in terms of what you asked with the story information, I think that was just a question of finding out how much people knew about the book, which was inherently educational, because so I kind of knew what it was about, and I was reading it at the time when I started making the game. So I thought, oh, people know what this is because everybody knows about like the windmill thing, right? And generally why that's funny. So the original story prompts were just like random mundane things. And the idea was that you were supposed to be a knight who you say like, you know, that's not a bus you're waiting for. That's, enemy army that is charging over, and then you're supposed to like behave like Don Quixote would, but in a modern setting. And that didn't work because nobody knew that Don Quixote was this knight that, imagined the mundane as legendary. And they were just like, okay, what do I do? I don't get it. And I mean, I've even seen that in there was one place I submitted it to where one of the pieces of feedback was, the world doesn't need another fantasy game with knights. And I'm like, oh gosh, you don't know what Don Quixote is. Because it's not a fantasy at all. He talks about giants and dragons, but they are like what that's what he imagines, like a windmill or an inn or somebody to, or like a flock of sheep to be. So that was interesting, but originally I thought like, well, they should be super vague, that'll let there be more improvisation. But I actually found that by laying out, you see windmills, you think they're giants, you want to attack the giants, go. Yeah. Is like enough information where people are like, I get it. I get the joke. You have to like tell people what the joke is so that they can write the joke.
All right, I see. That's interesting. Okay. Yeah. That's such an interesting one. Just again, like how the whole phase is, as you said, like some people won't have read the book that it's based on. So that's really interesting on how you're trying to expand on that. Like, is there any other way that you're trying to like make sure that you keep the story for those who have not read the book? Like myself, I've not read the Don Quixote. Oh no, I'm mispronouncing it. You can't really say it. But I've not read the book. So how have you found the balance for those who have read, as well as keeping along the people who may not be aware of it?
I think like one of the things that I fought against for a long time, but then eventually just finally am going to give into was in the chivalry cards. It has no text explaining what the chivalry card is. So you'll have like, just a phrase from a book of chivalry, and it's from like ones that were influences on Don Quixote, and then like the card effect, if it has one, that you can use to like screw with each other. And no text explaining what that's supposed to be. In some cases, that's been really funny because people would, it's like when you play, Super Fight, or if people are familiar with that, or if people are familiar with metagame, which is like cards or apples to apples even. But any game that is, that sort of call and answer type party game genre, but that includes arguing instead of just putting the card down. Sometimes in those games, if you don't know what it is, you just have to make it up. And there are people who can do that, and there are people that can't do that. And I've seen enough people say, I would really like some blurb here to explain what this is for me. I've finally seen enough of that where I was like, okay, this is a legitimate pattern. I should probably bite the bullet and do it. Yeah. The other thing was too is that it took somebody who was like a very experienced game designer to actually put it in terms of here's how this will affect your marketability. I was like, yes. So, yeah. Word to the wise, if you ever need to convince a stubborn game dev of something, talk about it in those terms and they'll be like, yes.
Yeah. Make them realize fast.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'll ask the question then. Do you believe this has inspired any teachings of level design?
So there's a little bit with, again, the flip-flopping of like visual information. So another thing that I write about a lot is visual information in level design, color theory, form, shape, symbol, things like that. How if you always put the save room behind the green door, then the green door means save room, things like that. The mixing and matching of visual plus text to conflict for comedic effect was really cool, and I'd love to do more with that. I think that's really neat. So there's some level design in there that you can imagine how that would play out in a game world, could play out in a game world. The other thing that I thought about, and in terms of the journey deck specifically, and especially after my last playtest. So before, it was just a deck of cards, and they would just mix and match however they were shuffled. That did two bad things. One of which was when you just open a new pack, they're all in order, so things would not... you'd just get streaks of stuff. And sometimes that could be streaks of just like, okay, another encounter, this is getting kind of monotonous. Or you'd get streaks of the feats, which are the challenges, which will like, if you fail a bunch of difficult ones, that could be very demoralizing. So from the last playtest, we sat down and we looked at this and we were like, well, what can we do? And one of the suggestions I received was, find a way to split that deck into 3 parts. And I was saying, well, in the story, Don Quixote goes on 3 what are called sallies, which are basically the 3 times he goes out on a journey. And I was like, well, there's your metaphor. But basically what each of those sally decks are is the first part, which is like easy cards. So it eases you into the gameplay. Second part, mix and match. Maybe there's a few challenging cards, but mostly cards that'll help you gear up. And then the third part is almost all difficult feats. So that's like the finale. And that was very much like, I felt like I was level designing, because the metaphor is space. It's a journey. It's a quest. So you're sculpting what somebody sees from point A to point B to point C to point D and so on. So that, that was always present in a very loose way, but now that I've really made it a more detailed design to give it basically a better difficulty curve, then it's like, oh, now I'm level designing. Now I'm actually trying to find things that I think would be funny. The first deck of those is going to have some cards that people would be like, I recognize this because this is in popular culture and from Don Quixote, to very funny things. So it'll give people a really good like stinger intro sort of thing, kind of the equivalent of like when you play God of War and it's sort of like, welcome to our game. Here's Poseidon. Stab him in the face. Wasn't that fun? Well, we're going to take away all your power, but you'll get stuff like that later if you hang with us. Yeah. I love that in games. I love it when a game introduces itself to you by giving you something ginormous to fight. There's no huge things to fight at the beginning, but there are like things that are really funny. And, it's all the cards that I notice that people really get attached to very fast. So that's a sort of like, I'm trying to build that flow. And then by the time you get to the more like esoteric cards, you're in it. And you're like, okay, so I'm less familiar with this situation, but, I'm having fun. So yeah.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. I wouldn't even thought about that. But again, like you said, the elements that cross paths, you said like color theory and and things like that. Like, I think that's really interesting. Yeah, I wouldn't even thought about it. So it's very, very cool and very interesting just to hear.
Yeah.
How you put that together, man.
Yeah. Thank you. I've really high hopes for this. Like, it's won a few awards, so I'm pretty excited. But again, like, always, and thank you for giving me time on your, podcast about mostly digital games to talk about it. But, like, yeah, it does make me think about the design of game worlds a lot when you do bring these things together. I always tell people, don't think of these games as like this straight line of, okay, now I've learned 3D, I never have to do 2D again. It's not like that. It's like, I have a project, what's right for the project? Maybe it's a tabletop game. And it's just like, it's less of a mountain to climb and more of like a tool belt to fill with like these different things you can bring out at appropriate times.
Yeah, man. Well, I mean, I think that's really interesting because it's because of that how I discovered your book. I was when you mentioned about just because you learn 3D, don't think you don't have to worry about 2D. It was the GDC talk by I believe it was Liz Brown did Hyperlight Drifter.
Lisa Brown.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And, that's how I came across your work because of how she'd talked about how she'd applied these things, especially coming from why is the other game she spoke about? It was Hyperlight Drifter and it's the
Sunset Override.
Thank you, that's the one. Yeah, where you're sliding everywhere, and I think that's such a great point. And I mean, that's one of the other reasons I wanted you to talk about this, because it's just such an interesting way to learn about design, and it's all applicable in that sense of something to learn, something you've taken from something else that you may not have even realized, but it's applicable here.
I have kind of a funny story about that presentation too, because she emailed me to say, hey, I really enjoyed your book and I'm including it in my GDC talk. It's really great to reach out to you. Am I doing this right? And Hyperlight Drifter is one of my favorite games.
I was excuse the pun, hyped for when it's coming out. It was amazing. Absolutely loved that game.
It has everything in it that I love about video games.
Yeah.
Like, it is so good. And my reaction, like, she was like, wow, hey, I'm using this. Am I doing it right? And I'm just like, oh, excuse me. Sorry.
So excited.
I knocked my headphones off.
That's brilliant.
Where was I? I was saying, I got this email and I'm like, oh my God, I love your game. I love your game. I love your game. I'm like fanboying out on the other end. And, I tried to really keep it together while I was writing the email reply back. I was like, yeah, that looks like you got it.
Yes.
In secret, I'm like, oh my gosh. They did such good work on that.
Phenomenal.
But yeah,
some of the bosses as well, like,
oh my gosh,
drove me insane, but for good, in a good way.
Yeah. But yeah, no, she's super fantastic. I think she's just like a brilliant designer.
Yes.
I love her work. I think she's fantastic. Okay, so I actually do need to go in a few minutes.
Okay.
So let's do that other thing.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, this is the other thing, because you've got quite a special announcement that hopefully we can share with this on this episode. But what is that, my friend?
I can announce that as of spring 2019, I'm being told, so actually pretty fast, there will be a second edition of An Architectural Approach to Level Design, which is my level design book about the influences that real-world architecture can have on game worlds.
That's fantastic. That is brilliant.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited about it. Things that I want to add to it. I want to, I think, make some of the language in it jive more with industry terminology and tone. Like, when I wrote it, I was I always tell people like kind of a young game academic trying to impress game academics. Right. But now I read it, I'm like, who is this guy? It's like, just use a first person, like singular, say I made this, like, so I'm trying to, I liven up some of that a little bit, awesome. Make it not come off as dry. But even more so, like I said, there's a lot of writing that's been done about level design in the meantime. So I want to, provide a way to point people towards those sources. And that might be like, I right before we recorded this, I did some sketches of, cool GDC talks that I saw. Some of it was, so like levels that were mentioned in cool GDC talks, I sketched those out. I would, I'm going to talk about things like scene design and other architectural theory that I've read since. Yeah. Some of the diagramming methods from like Mark Brown and Jeremy Parrish has been doing a lot with from Retronauts has been doing a lot with drawing maps the way we would before there were auto map features in games. Okay. Yeah, so trying to talk about that as like a process a bit. And then what else? So there are going to be 2 new, like all new chapters. One of them is on game tutorials. So, just in some of the work that I've been doing, building like educational games and tutorials for games that I'm working on as I play test. And then one that's on from a level designer's perspective, like from a more handcrafting level designer perspective, look at procedural generation.
That's interesting. Okay, because I worked on Division Underground, which was procedural level design, so that's very interesting.
Yeah, and like I don't claim to be a person who is an expert in procedural content generation at all, but I have a number of really great colleagues and friends who like that is what they do. They're from like the UC Santa Cruz crew. Oh, okay. Who that is like what they do there. Yeah. And they've made some pretty fantastic things. Pardon my dog is running around in the background in case you can hear it. But they're part of that world and they've taught me a lot, but I talk a lot about like prepping assets just for like those sorts of systems. How to change your mindset a little bit when you're trying to switch over to that. And then likening it to Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander, which is a really great book on architecture, but also designing in like chunks.
Yes, I've heard
that you could build
book,
levels. It's a really good book. Everybody should have it. And then the other thing I'm doing is I've gotten some folks from industry to submit like little mini essays on like a game they're working on or their process or something that they think about in terms of game worlds that matches up with content from the chapters. So that's what I've been working on with it. I'm pretty excited. I think it's going to make it hopefully a better book. People seem to like the first edition, but I think it'll get even better with the second edition because it's going to respond to some cool new trends, I think.
Fantastic. No, I'm excited. I'm sure everyone else is. But I don't want to keep you for much longer because you said you've got to go. But I just want to say thank you very much, mate, for joining me for this episode. It's been absolutely amazing to talk to you and hear your mind and how you think, mate. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This has been really wonderful. I'm a big fan.
Thank you very much, man. I'm a fan of yours as well. Containing my fanboyness is what I've been doing for this last hour. So, no, but just thank you again. And for those who want to reach you and find out more information about you, mate, where can they find that?
So again, I'm at Kent State University at the Tuscaroras campus in Ohio. You can email me at ctotten, Totten, at kent.edu. My studio's website is pfbstudios.com. pfbstudios.com, Pie for Breakfast Studios, pfbstudios.com. And hopefully by the, definitely by the time this is released, there will also be La Mancha on Kickstarter. So go check that out. We're going to have some pretty good, tweets about both the game and about, the educational elements of it, the literature it's based on, things like that to go along with that. So it should be informative, but also like you can come and back us and get a cool card game out of it. So please check that out as well.
Awesome.
And you can follow me on Twitter at Totter, Totter 87, awesome. And at PFB Studios.
Brilliant. All of this will be down in the links in the description down below, so you can all check that out. I will be back in the Kickstarter as well because I'm excited for it, and I want to sing to my friends. So now I don't need to worry about why. I can just have an excuse to do so. So
yes, if you've wanted to sing to your friends, this is your excuse.
Exactly. So thank you again, mate, and we'll catch you all next time.